Friends, I have an announcement to make. We've arrived. Today is my 26th video. Okay, I was supposed to do this on my 25th. 1/4 of 100, a fourth of a centenary. That's kind of a big deal. 25 is worth celebrating. But then I had this excellent conversation with Darian that was so good that I couldn't resist posting it beforehand, throwing my entire plan off kilter. Thanks, Darian. So, belated festivities. 25! Yay! And I've planned an important video for this special event. A video that gets to the core of my approach to ideas. A video that will surely change the history of the history of history. But before I begin, a word of gratitude and an exhortation. As of the recording of this video, I have, against any and all my expectations, more than 100 subscribers. And I want to say that I am deeply thankful to you all for your support, your interest, your comments, your excellent good taste, and your very existence. As for all y'all who are not yet subscribed to this channel, I mean, what are you doing? What are you even doing? Don't you know what you're missing out on?
Get with the program, folks.
I mean, come on now, this isn't just any old channel. Where else are you going to find someone who is willing to insist irrationally on the importance of ancient Greek etymologies, dissect obscure Italian films, talk ad nauseum about books that none of the cool kids is reading, and tackle Niche Boy head on? Don't you realize that by supporting this channel you are showing your solidarity for high culture, human realization, and world peace? Do the right thing, folks. Smash that bell, ring that little thumb, utterly obliterate that subscribe button. Destroy it, crush it, annihilate it.
Annihilate.
1 second of your time and just a click of your mouse or a jab of your sweet little finger for lifelong returns from the best darn videos you'll find this side of the South Pole. It's a good deal. Subscribe now. So, formalities out of the way, let's get right down to it. People are always asking me, John, they ask, what's your philosophy? And I tells them, I says, get your own philosophy. So let me tell you a little bit about me. I've been around the block. I've changed my mind a time or two about life, the universe, and everything. I've been a communist, and I've been a laissez-faire capitalist, and I've been a monarchist. I've been a pagan, and an atheist, and a Christian. I was a vegan for a little while, and I was a keto carnivore for a little while. I've been an Aristotelian, and a Platonist, and a Nietzschean, and a Gurdjieffian, and an Evolian. I was even a Randian long ago. Okay, so apologies to all the Randians out there. I obviously meant objectivist. I've been a futurist, and I came pretty close to being a straight-up Luddite, worthy of the Quakers themselves. I've been a conservative, and a revolutionary conservative. I've stood all over the political spectrum, from the far left to the deep right to somewhere right there in the middle. I've been over it, and I've been under it. I've spiraled around it vulture-like and crept up on it like a cat and burrowed straight through it like a badger. I've moved amidst it interdimensionally, viewing it from the inside out. Friends, I've been around. I am, as it were, a vagabond in the realm of ideas. A rover, a nomad, a vagrant, you might say. And someone might well ask me,
John, when are you ever going to settle down and just finally decide once and for all what you think about things? When are you going to get yourself a philosophy?
To which I respond, I have no philosophy and hope never to be infected by such a crippling parasite. And that, friends, is the essence of the philosophical way of life. So we hear a lot of talk about philosophy and philosophers these days.
What's your philosophy? My philosophy is...
People nowadays can even have philosophies on specific topics. A person can have a philosophy on politics, on coffee drinking, on dogs. Now, I've mentioned the inflation of our language before in other videos. That process whereby once high and exclusive words are reduced in their value and universalized in their meaning in order to accord better with our democratic tastes, until they come to lose all of their value and to mean nothing at all. Other examples of this phenomenon include the words art, culture, and creation. These words, which were once restricted exclusively to very rare and noble things, can now refer to just about anything you please. A toilet on a pedestal? Art. A group of homeless people huddled around a flaming trash can? Culture. My 10-year-old son experimenting with peanut butter and potato chip sandwiches? Creation. Philosophy is another word which has suffered from this unhappy vulgarization. It's rather in vogue right now for internet creators to publicize their own philosophies. It's the going thing. And I'm here to say to all of these people, you don't have a philosophy. And if you do, maybe you'll want to rethink that. Stick with me, and let's see why. So, a philosophy by our contemporary view is something like all the ideas I have about such and such a topic. Everything I think I know about such and such a topic. And that is almost precisely the opposite of what philosophy originally meant. The word philosophy itself might have been coined by Pythagoras. There are rumors, but however that may be, we really owe it to Plato. Plato, who put it in the mouth of his Socrates. Now, I say his Socrates rather than just Socrates as such, because any talk of Socrates as such seems to me gratuitous and unaccountable. You see, Socrates never wrote anything. We can talk about Plato's Socrates, and we can talk about Xenophon's Socrates. We can talk about what other writers said Socrates said. But talking about just Socrates as such, is kind of a shady business. And it was the Platonic Socrates, and not Socrates as such, who had such an enormous influence on the courses of the West. So when we speak about the pre-Socratics, we should probably be talking about the pre-Platonics. One might say, very loosely speaking, that the pre-Platonic sages had philosophies much more similarly to the way that we use the word today, while Plato was a philosopher. Plato's Socrates is perhaps best remembered for the paradoxical remark that is ascribed to him: "I know that I know nothing." But, interesting fact, Plato's Socrates actually never says this. These words, verbatim, are to be found nowhere in Plato's oeuvre. What Plato's Socrates does say in the Apology is that he is the wisest who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is, in truth, worth nothing. This then could be taken as a working definition of philosophy. To know that one's philosophies are worthless. Alright, so what does this mean? Now, the whole "I know that I know nothing" thing has kind of obscured our vision of the Platonic Socrates. We can't really understand what he's saying to us because we ascribe this idea to him that doesn't actually occur in any of his speeches. We presuppose almost that he's proclaiming a kind of universal and total ignorance, that he's telling us that he has a total lack of any kind of knowledge. And yet Socrates never claims such a thing. In the Apology, in another place, he says that he neither knows nor thinks he knows anything really good or beautiful, and he calls this his wisdom. He possesses a kind of wisdom, but it is a worthless wisdom. That's very different from knowledge. That's very different from saying that he knows nothing at all. Elsewhere in the Phaedrus, Socrates openly claims that he possesses the erotic art. In the Symposium, he claims to be an expert in this erotic art. So the one thing that Socrates claims to really know anything about is erotics? Yet all Socrates ever does is just dialogue with people and converse with people endlessly and try to find the truth. In fact, in the Symposium, he's even taken to task for refusing to accept a lover. The implication is clear. Philosophy, somehow, is an erotic quest for the truth. Philosophy is the erotic love of the truth. It is, to use hopelessly inadequate but still somewhat effective modern language, a sublimation of the erotic tendencies of the human soul into intellectual matters. All of this is very closely related to the invitation of another great philosopher for us to suppose that truth is a woman. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, is actually a constant courtship. It's a courtship of truth, of knowledge, of wisdom. It is a perennially erotic courtship, one that does not end in consummation or in marriage. A love that never reaches a terminal point. Now, if you want to have a clear idea of what this looks like, all you have to do is really seriously consider the dialogic form of writing philosophy, of which Plato was the master. This kind of writing encourages one to thought and never to conclusion. Anyone who claims to know what Plato thought about anything whatsoever is pretty suspect. Pretty sus. The love of thought over the conclusions of thought is the philosophical attitude. This is the life of philosophy. Philosophy was originally prescribed not as a kind of system of thought, but as a way of life. And it involves continuously seeking what can never be found. It means being willing to take up ideas and lay them down again as need presses. It means being ready to change one's mind, even one's entire worldview, as and when there's cause for it. It means being happier when one is proved wrong than when one is proved right. It means loving truth more than one loves victory. The old European legends of the Grail Seekers can actually be taken as a representation of this, a kind of mythic metaphor for the philosophical way of life. These knights of old would wander across lands never known, facing dangers and perils never heard of, in search of a treasure beyond price which they might glimpse, but would never find. And it is highly suggestive, and is to be taken as an admonition to us that so many of these knights perished, or went mad, or returned to the court melancholic and broken. The philosophical way of life is tremendously difficult. It is even perilous. There are tremendous obstructions to it, temptations that would lead us from this path and force us into lesser kinds of life. And I want to focus my attention on 4 of these obstructions, these temptations. The 4 black nights whom the philosophical hero, the philosophical adventurer, has to face and fight, and in some way overcome. See, anyone who wishes to think or live philosophically is always running his ship right between Charybdis and Scylla, and 2 other marine monsters. There are 4 of them. Didn't really think this one through. Alright, so better yet. The philosophical adventurer is pitted against a dragon with 1 body and 4 heads, because each of these dangers is connected in some way to all of the others. They form a kind of ring or a circle, each one leading into the next. These dangers, these enemies of the philosophical way of life, could be labeled as follows: conviction, fatigue, misology, and shame. So let's take these on one by one and consider them individually. Conviction. Perhaps the greatest barrier to actually ever learning anything new is the conviction that one already knows. You have it figured out. You, of all of the billions of human beings presently living, and all of the 100 billion human beings who ever have lived, the great majority of whom completely disagree with you, and a goodly number of whom are far cleverer than you and have spent much more time considering these issues than you will ever spend, you alone have nonetheless discovered the truth. You've done it at last. Your coming into this world represents a historic moment. After all these millennia of seeking, of uncertainty, of confusion, the truth was at last born with you. We're proud of you. We're so proud of you. So it's one of the peculiarities of the human being that he can't help but take his own ideas overly seriously. We are excellent at seeing all of the ways in which our fellow human beings are confounded retrograde imbeciles, and at bringing their errors continually and sometimes obnoxiously into their awareness. We are not so good at performing the same service for ourselves. Our own ideas to us are clear, distinct, well-reasoned, and airtight. They are self-evidently correct. And it's just one of those inexplicable features of the cosmos that no one else is able to see just how totally correct our ideas actually are. But it's okay. We can form online communities of people who do agree with us. All the ones who have found the truth. And we can carefully hem ourselves into these self-contained and well-defended enclaves, the knowing among the knowers. Because there's the human being who knows, and there's the human being who doesn't know. And we knows. Why subject ourselves to the disorienting discomfort of taking seriously those who think radically differently than we do? Fortunately, in our modern world, that's no longer necessary. Our progress has rendered it superfluous, obsolete, a thing of the past. Convenient features like mute buttons, the suppression of so-called fake news, unfollowing and ghosting have rendered us all perfectly safe from hazardous contact with contaminated individuals and disagreeably contrary notions. We no longer have to come into contact with any wrong ideas. We're safe, protected, concealed, sheltered. Now, at bottom, this attempt, this attitude is profoundly narcissistic. One becomes so easily infatuated with one's own preliminary conclusions about any problem. And all conclusions in this human life of ours are, in the last analysis, preliminary. We love our ideas, not because they're right, but because they're ours. They come from us, and so we coddle them as if they were our children. Conviction, generally speaking, is a state of being enamored with oneself, of standing so close to one's own reflection that one loses all sense of proportion and all reason. Like Narcissus, one loses one's head for love of one's face. I'm so beautiful, I'm so wonderful, I'm so right. And beneath this, of course, is fear. The fear of losing one's self-respect. The fear of being proven wrong in one's favorable judgment of oneself. There is a strong element of self-defense here, as there is indeed in all human vanity. Now, the internet is a great spur to this particular vice, and we must be very well aware of this. The idea of the echo chamber is pointing to this precise problem. It is terrifyingly easy nowadays to surround ourselves almost continuously with concordant voices and de facto yes men. It is terrifyingly easy to avoid any kind of challenge to our views, even the slightest and the least abrasive. And the only way of breaking out of this cage is to actively and deliberately cultivate our willingness to look at other points of view, particularly those that stand farthest from us. And this in turn requires constant attempts to calmly and sympathetically dialogue with individuals whom we are constantly being encouraged to consider our enemies. Just think how hard it is for a Democrat to speak to a Republican in the United States civilly these days. If we can't relearn the art of conversation with people who disagree with us, then we will be far less philosophers than we will be posturers. The trouble, of course, is the conversation, and the true consideration of alien and outlandish ideas is hard, and it is time and energy consuming. And it leads to risks all its own. Fatigue. So our historical era has developed a kind of cult around clear writing. We owe this in no small part to Ernest Hemingway, who actually invented one new literary standard for every single cat he owned.
Wait a minute.
I don't know if you knew that fact, but now clarity of prose, clarity of writing is one of the great virtues of our times. But as always, the virtues of a time trail its vices behind them as so many shadows. Clarity is a great quality with all matters that can be approached clearly. It keeps us to a particularly charmed segment of existence, one ruled by light and airiness and lucidity. But there are other parts of existence beyond this one, and anyone who keeps exclusively and rigorously to the luminous quarters is crippling his mental man. I would even go so far as to say that if you read a book, and after the first reading you have a tolerably clear idea of what the author thinks, then either you haven't been reading carefully enough, or the book that you've just put down is not a particularly philosophical book. Now, in our time, it's hard enough to convince people to read a book one time. Who wants to read a book multiple times? Who wants to have to think ideas through again and again and again, correcting and rectifying and dissecting and discarding and augmenting and adjusting as necessary? That's a lot of work. And in the day of Wikipedia articles and ChatGPT and immediate access to practically all of the surface level knowledge of all of our history, many people nowadays are not exactly keen to exert themselves in the acquisition of any kind of deeper wisdom. If I can find any fact that I want by speaking into a handheld device, why in the world should I worry my pretty little head over all of those questions that the internet just isn't equipped to answer? Now, philosophical fatigue takes different forms. Its mildest is laziness, simply not having the energy or the desire to think things through. That can only be remedied through discipline, slowly habituating oneself to activity and to vigor. The more extreme, and by far the more dangerous form of this kind of fatigue, arises in that person who has spent years or decades of his life ruminating, meditating, pondering, digging carefully in the soil of philosophical discourse in the attempt to strike solid ground, to find some kind of bedrock, only to find nothing but sand, until he finally becomes weary of trudging forever through the swamp. This is the kind of exhaustion that comes in the long-time thinker, akin to desperation, the aching fear of never being able to find one's longed-for destination. Once you've changed worldviews, say 4 or 5 times, it's understandable that you might start to wonder what it's all about. What generally characterizes a crisis like this is forgetting the joy of the quest itself. This is a kind of fixation on ends rather than on means. It's a forgetting of philosophy as a way of life, and it's a proposing of philosophy as a means to a destination. When the destination can't be reached, the road comes into question. One forgets at the same time that the philosophical way of life is its own justification. The philosophical way of life comes with an ethic all its own. It naturally promotes a kind of human morality. It makes us into better people, and this is true in general of love. True love in this human life of ours makes us into better people. It's when we forget this that the problems start to come in. Now, at its worst, this kind of philosophical fatigue can lead to a still more vicious and degraded attitude. MISOLOGY. MISOLOGY may well be a word coined once again by Plato, and it literally means the hatred of the logos, hatred of reason, of conversation, of thinking, of dialectics. It is perhaps the closest thing we have in our language to an antonym for philosophy. Misosophy just doesn't quite do it. It sounds like some kind of oriental rice dish. Misosophy. Misology is also one of the hardest diseases in all the world to cure. It comes about when the exhausted thinker's despair at not being able to find the Grail transforms into open disgust for the quest itself. Socrates speaks of this problem in several of the Platonic dialogues, but perhaps most importantly in the Phaedo. This is also the most interesting moment at which he speaks of it, because in the Phaedo, Socrates is preparing for his own death. He's been found guilty by the Athenian court, he's refused to escape from prison in order to save his own life, and he is waiting in the room for the moment when the guards will bring him the poison which he's to drink, the hemlock, which will send him to his grave. And during this waiting, what does Socrates do? Well, obviously he discourses about philosophy. He gets into a conversation, a dialogue with some of his beloved students. And in the course of this dialogue, the conversation seems to reach a dead end. It reaches a point at which it's not clear how anything is going to proceed beyond. Now, dramatically speaking, all of these conversants are standing around waiting for Socrates to take poison and die. So there's already a little bit of an atmosphere, there's a little bit of weight on the situation. Things are a touch tense. And it's at this moment precisely that Socrates diagnoses the first movements of misology, as being a kind of feeling of betrayal when one's arguments fail one. Here's what he says. It is very melancholy, too, if there be such a thing as truth or certainty or power of knowing at all, that a man should have lighted upon some argument or other which at first seemed true, and then turned out to be false, and instead of blaming himself and his own want of wit, because he is annoyed, should at last be too glad to transfer the blame from himself to arguments in general, and forever afterwards should hate and revile them, and lose the truth and knowledge of existence. One begins to lose one's faith in reason, in the possibility of reason at all, in the possibility of truth-seeking, or in the logos by which one might ascend nearer to the truth. Misology comes not from the loss of trust in a single argument, but from loss of trust in argumentation as such, in thinking as such. The misologist, to the degree that he falls into his misology, not only disbelieves the possibility of truth, but he militantly attacks any attempt to gain it. In the bitterness and the closure and the darkness of his soul, he would pervert and mislead all those who are not yet bitter and closed and dark. Now, Socrates was brought to trial in the first place for, among other things, corrupting the young. It's still an open question as to whether philosophers do corrupt the young, but this much is certain. The botched attempt at philosophy, the would-be philosopher, who has been lost to the spirit of misology, most certainly corrupts the young, and corrupts them in the worst possible of ways. Misology is connected profoundly and intimately to the more modern phenomenon of nihilism, to the willful and insistent denial of the possibility of truth as such, to the possibility of meaning as such. Just as misplaced convictions are the product of a concealed self-love, so misology is the product of a concealed self-hate. And just as the convicted human being will insist upon his convictions in order to protect his tumescent self-regard, so the misologist will insist upon the impossibility of truth in order to protect the torn remnants of his self-regard. This is the extremist form of misology, and it is a darkness of the soul from which it is almost impossible to return, for the very simple reason that one has essentially cut off the sources of light which would illumine one's way out. It's probable that the only way of escape to such a one comes in the form of religious conversion. But there's also a lesser form of misology, and this amounts less to an outright hatred of the logos than to a strong preference for other loves, whether the love of wealth or the love of power. But one among all these loves tends to be the strongest and the commonest and perhaps the most antagonistic to philosophy, and that is the love of the people. Shame. In one of my favorite of the Platonic dialogues, the Gorgias, Socrates, after arguing with two orators, Gorgias and Polus, comes into a long and intense dialogue with a young man named Callicles. Callicles begins by promoting an almost proto-Nietzschean philosophy, and then he's forced to defend his philosophy in the face of Socrates' relentless questioning. Over the course of this dialogue, Socrates makes an interesting observation that the first two interlocutors, that is again Gorgias and Polus, stopped speaking because they were shamed. But Callicles refuses to be shamed. The most dramatic portion of their exchange ends with an equally fascinating statement again from Socrates. It is the love of the people, Callicles, existing in your soul, which stands against me. So let's consider these remarks. The shame that made Gorgias and Polus fail in their conversations is the shame of falling publicly into contradiction. They couldn't abide being shown up as wrong in front of other people. This shame affects an astounding amount of human behavior. We don't like to be wrong. We don't like to be inconsistent. Still less do we like being proved wrong or inconsistent in the face of onlookers. Here again, the internet has magnified and exacerbated this human tendency, because anything we do or say online puts us on stage in front of an unknown and potentially enormous number of other human beings. The feeling that we must save face, prove ourselves right, stand our ground, be consistent, not contradict ourselves, prove the other guy wrong. All of this is overwhelming. Even remarks that we make, in which we have the least of stakes, suddenly become central convictions to us in need of urgent and energetic defense, the moment they are called into question by anyone. Still more so if somebody suggests that this thing we've said might contradict some other thing that we've said. We thus find ourselves locked into our own statements, as if they were the bars of our prison. Sadly, we forget Emerson's very pertinent remark. The foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. This kind of shame is certainly detrimental to the philosophical way of life, and it's the sort of shame that we should be continually educating ourselves against. That can be done quite simply by admitting that you're wrong in conversations when you know that you're wrong in conversations. What does it really cost you on an internet comment board, for example, to just acknowledge that the other guy made a good point? The internet, to the very extent that it pushes us in the wrong direction, also offers us a marvelous number of possibilities to train ourselves. But there is a deeper shame still than the shame of being publicly called out or publicly contradicted. And it's the shame not of Gorgias or Paulus in this dialogue, but of Callicles, who's supposed to be shameless. Now, it comes out in the course of the conversation with Socrates that the thing Callicles most fears is being put at the mercy of the people. Athens at this time was a little bit unstable. Every now and then it would just be overthrown by tyrants who just kind of imprison or kill or exile all of their political opponents. And Callicles fears being jailed or beaten or executed. His power philosophy is built as an attempt to try to avoid these unfortunate ends. He does not want to be put to shame in the eyes of the many. The thing that he focuses on the most, interestingly enough, is being beaten. This is the other side of the common desire for glory, for fame, for accolades. This kind of shame is less an embarrassment at being called out on an inconsistency than it is a desire to be loved by the masses. It's the kind of shame which produces tyrants, and it's the kind of shame that cannot cohabitate in the soul with the philosophical impulse. One or the other must be master there. The two cannot coexist. Now, the only cure for this trouble is the virtue which would only be named by Christianity, and that is to say, humility. Socrates exemplified this virtue avant la lettre. He lived his life in a kind of sublime disregard for anything other than the beautiful, the good, and the true. And that is the essence of the philosophical life, giving up the lower things in order to focus exclusively on the higher things. And it demands, as Socrates also teaches us again in the Phaedo, a certain kind of death to the world, a willingness to die to the world. Philosophy is a preparation for death, a death to the worldly interest in money, in notoriety, in popularity, but also to the petty false virtues of consistency for consistency's sake and automatic acceptance of everything that we are taught. Consistency is good only if one is right. Obedience is good only if one is obedient to the true authorities. We must not fear intellectual change as such. We must not fear even overthrowing our entire worldview if need be. Our ability to do so is, in many cases, the only saving grace of our limited, mortal, and fallible human existences. The one thing that saves us from perishing from our repeated mistakes, and wallowing in the very worst of what this world has to offer. And this, to my mind, returning to my last video, is the true meaning of human liberty. So to broach a question which came up as well in that video, how do we avoid the transformation of human liberty into mere anarchy? How avoid the collapse of philosophy with its free quest for the truth into relativism? Relativism is one of the great afflictions of our time. But it takes a great many different forms. We like to speak about relativism as if it were a singular, monolithic thing, but in fact there are many different kinds of relativism. It's not just a singular illness. And in fact, for example, there is a relativism for each of the single evils of which we've spoken today. There is the relativism of conviction, the absolute refusal to believe that any other point of view has the least shred of truth in it, because one relates all of these things, everything, exclusively to one's own view of the world. There is the relativism of exhaustion, one's being too weary to even try to understand. One's just letting everyone go their own way and do their own thing to avoid the tiring obligation of having to analyze and assess. There's the relativism of misology, the relativism which refuses to acknowledge even the possibility of an eternal and unchangeable truth, because one has come to hate that possibility deep within one's soul. And there is the relativism of shame, that relativism which forgoes the love of truth in favor of the lust for power. Relativism is a natural and continual tendency, a perennial threat for the philosophical mindset. It's not for nothing that we learn that many of the old philosophers transformed almost into animals in the course of their lives. Heraclitus was said to end up outside the rubble of an old temple eating grass like a cow. The Cynics were named for the Greek word for dog, because they were said to live like dogs. The philosophical quest without a center of gravity risks succumbing to relativism at every step. The uncentered philosophical quest is tantamount to throwing an unarmed adventurer out into a vast and nameless wilderness, with neither compass nor direction, and that is bound to end in disaster. This is one of the great delicate balancing acts that must come with any kind of philosophical way of life. The philosopher needs to be at once open to all possibilities, and at the same time to stand firm enough on stable and unshifting ground that he's not carried away by any given tide or rush of wind. The knights on their quest for the Grail must have a Camelot to which they may return. What then can be our Camelot? As an Orthodox Christian, I believe that the truest anchor, the one anchor which does not move and which is secured and guaranteed, is the immutable tradition of the Christian faith. That tradition vouchsafes truths which entirely transcend human reason and our ability to discern or to discover. And in the light of those truths alone, the quest for human wisdom becomes really possible. This tradition grants us knowledge from God, about God, a God who stands so far over his creation that he is incomprehensible and unattainable to us, save as he reaches down to us, opening a door into our very humanity itself through his own incarnation in our common flesh. Without such a center, without a gauge, we are compelled to choose between a philosophical mindset which is equivalent to being completely lost in the world on the one hand, and simply adopting a partial truth with all of our force and all of our power and all of our commitment, completely arbitrarily on the other. Anyone who would like to know what that looks like is invited to look back at the past century and all of the disasters that attended to it. Without a center of gravity, we are awash truly on a sea of nihilism, an abyss without border and without bottom, whose natural, perhaps inevitable action in our lives is to provoke chaos and promote madness. Let us never forget how Nietzsche ended his life. So, cheery note to end on, yes? We're all smiling now, right? That's how it should be. I truly believe that this question of philosophy, this question of how we approach ideas, and the particular relationship that we establish between ourselves and the potential sources of truth, really is going to determine a great deal about our day and our time. Our position on this particular question will make all the difference on the political level, the social level, as our societies continue to unravel at their seams and to feel the want of new centers of gravity. We're in a moment of final transition. Things are changing rapidly under our feet. And in our attempt to grasp onto any kind of driftwood which can save us in the coming flood, we're very often tempted to simply adopt positions with a great deal of firmness and rigidity in which we don't actually believe. We must be very careful about what we grapple to. And it would be better, in my view, as much as it's possible to us, to maintain a degree of impartiality in all of these changes and all of these great shifts that are underway. It seems to me the one way we actually have of potentially maintaining our humanity in times of great disruption. So with that, again, thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you for being here on this almost 25th episode of my channel. I really can't tell you how much your presence means to me. The fact that you made it this far so that you're actually listening to these words, well now, that means a great deal. Thank you. In all probability, I'll have something a little bit different in my next video. I think I'll be responding to another video here on YouTube, so that might be worth seeing. In the meantime, I am going to put myself a rigorous limit here, and I'm going to tell you that if you look down in the description for this video, you will find a link to my book, Man of Loxley.
An ancient prophecy is coming true.
This is a novel that I've written, a retelling of the myth, the legend of Robin Hood. So, if it's not there, let that just go to show you how disorganized I am. And I hope you'll follow me anyway. Don't unsubscribe because of that. Anyway, you will certainly find, at any rate, a link to my Substack channel where I have some of my writings, some short stories, as well as my ongoing serial publication of my Western novel, Sacrifice. So, I hope that you'll join me for that. And since you've gotten to the end of this video, if you've liked what you've seen and you haven't subscribed yet, why not? I mean, why not? Alright, thank you all very much, and until next time, farewell.